Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Beth Jensen. I'm Director of Climate Plus Impact at Textile Exchange, and we have a whole host of speakers for you today to introduce our Biodiversity Landscape Analysis report, which we're really pleased to be launching. Just a few housekeeping items. For everyone who registered for this webinar, you will be receiving an email with a link to the slide deck and the recording afterward. The recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, on the Textile Exchange YouTube channel. And please feel free to use the Q&A function throughout, and we will be leaving some time at the end to answer any questions that folks might have. So please utilize that question and answer box in Zoom. Okay, moving to the next slide. Great. So this is really a team effort, given the importance of the topic of biodiversity to the fashion, apparel, and textile sector, and all of the different organizations that are really working on this. From the beginning, this was really a collaborative effort between Textile Exchange, Conservation International, and the Fashion Pact. And then biodiversity was our lead consultant in terms of, sort of putting pen to paper on this report. And of course, our sponsors, J. Crew Group, Madewell, and then Puma. We thank you so much, because this report would not have been able to happen without their support as well. And you'll be hearing from both of the sponsors during this webinar today. So just a quick reminder of the Textile Exchange Climate Plus strategy, which we've had in place for a number of years now. And this is really saying that, obviously climate and greenhouse gas emissions is a North Star for our industry. And at the same time, we can't lose sight of other topics like biodiversity, soil health, and water, fresh water in particular, that are all really interdependent for our industry. And I think really having the opportunity to lay out kind of all of the foundational grounding on the topic of biodiversity and the broader topic of nature, really, throughout this Biodiversity Landscape Analysis report, really solidified this strategy and this direction for us at Textile Exchange. And as you'll see, we really firmly believe that climate and nature are two sides of the same coin. And so needing to move more into this space of nature and biodiversity is something that we're really pleased to be able to provide some grounding around with this report. And then, just a quick introduction to the report. So kind of how did this come to be? Many of you will, I think, or I hope, will have seen our Regenerative Agriculture Landscape Analysis report. And that was really the first sort of model template, so to speak, in this format of kind of trying to lay out, what do we know about this topic? What do we not know? What are some of the key definitions and terms? What are some of the key frameworks that are in use? And what does this really mean for the industry, for our industry specifically? So, we really wanted to try to, at a bit more of a granular level, prevent duplication of the research and fact-finding efforts that are already underway with individual companies, and really provide that central and thoughtful reference point to answer some of the key questions about biodiversity and the broader topic of nature that brands and other stakeholders are coming with. So hopefully we were successful at this and successful at, really distilling and synthesizing some of the key informational pieces around biodiversity and nature. And, we'll certainly be looking to use this as a jumping off point for future efforts, which we'll talk about toward the end of the webinar. But just to give you a little orientation to the structure of the report, part one is really, foundational background information and context related to biodiversity and its relevance to our industry. And then part two is related to guidance and how to navigate the different action frameworks and how companies can take action to protect and restore biodiversity. And on that note, I'll turn to Natalie from the Fashion Pact to give us a bit of an overview about the current guidance landscape related to biodiversity.
Thank you, Beth. And hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. Nice to see many of you again. I'm Natalie. I'm the project manager for biodiversity and low-impact materials at the Fashion Pact. And very excited that this report has been launched. And so I just want to kind of situate where the biodiversity landscape analysis lives in kind of the context of the broader guidance landscape. At the Fashion Pact, we've really been focusing on biodiversity for the past couple of years, namely through a project that we co-executed with Conservation International and funded by the Global Environment Facility. And so over the past 2.5, 3 years, we released a slew of tools and resources that will help companies understand their impacts on nature, understand their relationship with nature, their risks when it comes to biodiversity, so that they can kind of move forward, set strategies, and take actions. And so where does the biodiversity landscape analysis fit in this? This report is really one of the first crucial steps, right? It provides a shared centralized reference point, kind of the current state of play of biodiversity in the fashion industry, its impacts on raw materials in the initial production stages of our supply chains. And so we really see this report that we're going to discuss today as kind of one of the first entry points that companies can use and use again as centralized reference point, upon which then there's a number of other tools and resources that we've been producing in partnership with CI, in partnership with Textile Exchange, for you to kind of go a step further. So some of these would be, for example, the Biodiversity Strategy Tool Navigator. All of this is available on our website as well, thefashionpact.org. But you can go through and really see, okay, what tools are out there that can help you at each stage of the science-based target for nature pathway, or looking at the fashion nature risk lens, in which you can kind of look at different impacts and risks related to land footprint use or deforestation. So there's a slew and there's a number, let's say, of tools and resources available. But today is very exciting, and it's a really great entry point for everybody, whether you are at the beginning or you're very advanced, you're a real expert. And so I encourage you to kind of engage with this report and with all of the other tools and resources that are out there. And that's it for me, I think. Let's move forward. Franklin, I'll hand it over to Franklin Hawley now, I think. Yes, to Franklin. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Natalie. Thanks, Beth. And apologies, everybody. It is the season of colds here where I am, so I'm a little bit under the weather, but hopefully you can hear me okay and fresh this morning. But so excited to have everybody join us. I have the pleasure and honor of going a little bit into depth in the rationale for the report and a little bit more about biodiversity in the textile industry. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm Franklin Hawley. I'm the Director of Sustainable Fashion at Conservation International, and we have really been excited to join together with Textile Exchange, with the Fashion Pact, with Biodiversify, as well as our supporting partners and TE members to bring this report to you. We can go to the next slide, but hopefully you're sensing optimism from me, but often, we start with both the rationale for why do we need to work in this space, as well as, what's the motivation for the biodiversity landscape analysis report from maybe a less optimistic perspective, which is around the urgency and the need for biodiversity action and nature action. As I think all of you are keenly aware, hopefully, based on your interest in this call and in this report, we have dueling crises at the moment, a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis. And we have really come upon a moment in time where we need to act now, or we will not be able to reverse or enact positive change going forward when it comes to nature and when it comes to climate. And hopefully you've heard that message reinforced through the different partners who have spoken this morning. But this is just a slide to give you a sense. If you haven't seen the Planetary Boundaries report, the latest one that came out, I really encourage you to take a look at it. You can see over the course of several years here, kind of we are trending in the wrong direction when it comes to surpassing the boundaries of our planet in terms of biosphere integrity, climate change, ocean acidification, land system change, and that all has impacts on biodiversity. And as I said, kind of most recent report came out, we have surpassed the majority of the planetary boundaries. And again, things things will look better when we are all, doing better and moving towards nature positive outcomes, and that includes biodiversity. So next slide, please. I just hit my own keys to try to advance the slide. That was very successful. However, um, there's a lot of complications with respect to, how do we address nature impacts? How do we address biodiversity? What does biodiversity even mean? And so we wanted to put together this wordgram, if you will, to really just show the complicated nature of biodiversity, but actually the interrelated aspects of biodiversity. And it's quite possible that a lot of the work that all of you are already doing, if you're not explicitly working on biodiversity yet, is actually having a good impact for biodiversity. We just need to do more and be much more deliberate in our actions. And so hopefully this, shows you a few ways, deforestation, for instance, various frameworks. You all may be pursuing SBTI and SBTI flag targets, as well as SBTN, for instance. We'll come back to those in a little bit. Regeneration, all of these things contribute to biodiversity. But it also, I think, articulates just the nature of, again, the complexities and the different, the nuances of biodiversity and the interrelatedness of biodiversity with healthy ecosystems, nature positive ecosystems, what processes are impacting biodiversity, what targets need to be set, and how. And so what we really wanted to do with this was just kind of show that the report itself is meant to address a little bit of the word soup, if you will, in biodiversity. Just unpack it, become a reference point for those of you who are looking to start on your journey or pick up at any point where you may be. Demystify terms and look at metrics, look at opportunities for starting on that journey or continuing into bigger and bolder steps. Next slide, please. Thanks. And you'll see these terms again later, but we wanted to really drive home, again, kind of building from that word soup. Describing biodiversity and how to approach it is multifaceted. And we know that. And so we know that it is helpful to have an orientation to that multifaceted space, which again, the report is really meant to do. And, when you're looking at climate and nature, there are ways to look at impacts as well as look at, how do you measure progress, if you will, monitor baselines and then measure progress through things like, biodiversity measured via biodiversity intactness and how intact is an ecosystem or the biodiversity within that ecosystem. You can look at, again, at an ecosystem level, at things like ecosystem integrity. And we need these multiple tiers, multiple layers of information to really tell us the full picture of biodiversity. And what you see in the quote at the bottom is just a note that, again, reemphasizing the point that we need to look at biodiversity from angles that we have, let's say, in the non-scientific community, more traditionally thought of biodiversity, so species related, right? Can we get down on the ground and count the number of species? Are they, are they plentiful? Are they threatened? Are they endangered? And count those species on the ground to give us an indication of the health of biodiversity. But what we know, again, sort of is that we need to have intactness. We need to have ecosystem integrity to really support those biodiverse systems. And so, as we move into things like the science-based targets for nature and for you all putting together biodiversity strategies that are really reflective of the complexities of biodiversity and nature and the ways that business is impacting those things, we need to look at it from multiple lenses. Next slide. And this is just a little bit more of some context on targets. You guys would have seen the word targets in that first word slide. I know a lot of you all are setting targets, interested in setting targets. We're absolutely thrilled to have been part of the biodiversity benchmark, for example, and seeing the results of that and seeing the increase in members who are really interested in pursuing science-based targets for nature, as well as those members who have set and are setting public biodiversity strategies. But when you take a step back from there, and you look at kind of how do all the pieces fit together between, what's happening at a local level with biodiversity, how does that roll up into, let's say, science-based targets for nature, targets for land. So there are 3 targets within SBTN around halting conversion, reducing agricultural footprint, and landscape engagement. There are also SBTN targets for water, as many of you know, around water quality and water quantity, and both of those, in the land space and the water space will have are having impacts on biodiversity, as well as need targets to be set so that we can turn that around to be a positive impact. Um, but the idea really is that, those targets are rolling up into ultimately this global biodiversity framework that, as we know from last year's CBD COP, and the Center for Biological Diversity COP, we know that coming out of that, we're really successful in making it clear at a global level that there is an ongoing biodiversity crisis and that there need to be targets that are set similar to climate targets, to be able to coexist, let's say, on this planet, to not lose more biodiversity and ultimately to not threaten our own livelihoods as well. And so there are 4 goals and 23 targets that came out of the GBF. Those are broken down in the report a little bit as well. But hopefully this just gives you a sense again of not to be alarmist, to be optimistic that there's movement both at a global level in support of the kinds of action that companies are now looking at tackling through frameworks like the Science-Based Targets for Nature. We can go to the next slide. And this slide is really just meant to deep dive into the textile industry's impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. We know that they are there's a multitude of impacts on biodiversity, but looked at in a positive light, that's also a myriad opportunity for reversing losses and reversing those impacts, so that they can be positive outcomes for nature and biodiversity, and ultimately for us as humans who depend on these resources. And we see it, up across the top. You see extensive grazing management, you see crop management, and you see forest management. And those 3 buckets really belong in that, agricultural and nature-based raw materials extraction, kind of tier 4, right, of sourcing in the sector. And that's where we see the biggest impacts on biodiversity at a global level. Certainly when you drill down into watersheds, into again, ecosystems or subregions, jurisdictional regions, ecoregions, it's important to look at the entire supply chain. But when you look at a global level, we know that the biggest impacts are in these 3 buckets across the top. But again, lots of opportunity for turning that around. And the report will go into detail in each of these, into exactly what does it mean when you have conversion and habitat fragmentation contributing to forest loss, or the impacts of crops and crop production, or extensive grazing on habitat fragmentation, and then what practices specifically can feed back into positive outcomes. Let's go to the next slide, please. And again, just emphasizing that at a global level, production, implementation of agricultural production, and what we have seen from the sector is that's really a huge opportunity for the outcomes to then contribute, not from a negative impact, but in being a positive impact for nature, and looking at regenerative agriculture, for example, or or opportunities to figure out, where is that intact habitat or intact biodiversity that we can then protect, or possibilities for restoration of that. We can go to the next slide. And this is where, again, getting back to a little bit of what I was saying on the last slide, what we have done with biodiversity and with the nature dialogue and with this report is really open up from an understanding that yes, agricultural production is, a big impact and a big opportunity area, but that means that we can't just focus on, let's call it fence row to fence row or farm boundaries, or production lands boundaries. We have to look at, again, getting back to biodiversity being an ecosystem level, having ecosystem integrity, having biodiversity intactness, that is going to include those surrounding landscapes. And understanding that having the most positive outcomes that we can for nature and biodiversity means using what we call the AR3T approach, where we're really focusing on avoiding the loss of avoiding further habitat loss, reducing impacts on those currently managed lands, restoring degraded lands, as well as regenerating those productive lands, and then transforming ultimately at a landscape level. And so, as some of these metrics are used in the Science Based Targets for Nature framework. And so, hopefully, that gives you a little bit of the rationale as to why that's important for biodiversity. And again, the report will go into more detail. Next slide. And ultimately, I think this is just a quote to reinforce that that we can do this. That is, ag operations are unique and complicated landscapes, but we know that there are a lot of variables in agriculture, and we know that there's amazing creativity, amazing innovation. There are also a lot of known practices and regenerative approaches that we can use to turn things around and rehabilitate what is needed, as Colette has said. Let's go to the next slide. This is a snapshot of a few of the maps that you'll see throughout the report. This just is meant to emphasize and give you a sense of the size of the prize, if you will, or the overlap, let's say, between biodiversity hotspots around the world and production countries. This is again at a country level for production, by the way. So so good to note that it's not highly granular, but it gives you a sense of the fact that depending on where your materials are coming from, you're going to have you're likely to have impacts on biodiversity, and then understanding more precisely about where those materials are from will give us more and more information about not just where the impacts are happening, but what the opportunities are for success. Again, whether it's in that avoid bucket. So in these hotspot areas, can we avoid further losses surrounding the hotspot areas where there may be up or downstream impacts? Can we mitigate? Can we reduce? Can we regenerate, for instance, and start to think at a sort of holistic biodiversity and nature level. Let's go to the next slide. And finally, there are a set of recommendations in the report that we want to share with you that hopefully you've heard us iterate over the last couple of years if you've been along with us, as CI has started to really engage in this space. But the first course of action that we're looking at and working with brands is taking a science-based approach to inform decision making. And we want to emphasize that the science-based targets for nature framework is one approach, and from CI's vantage point, an incredibly important one. But we also know that it is also complex, and the report seeks to demystify some of that, as do some of those other resources that Natalie was speaking to. But there are, also other partners in the space, and the report identifies those as well. All of those included on this webinar, in addition to others who can help navigate that space and get, meet companies where they are, understand what you may know of your supply chain, and begin that journey wherever you may be, depending on, irrespective, let's say, of the amount of traceability or transparency you may have. Next slide. And also, again, just emphasizing we need to act on a landscape level. Biodiversity is linked to land management. It's linked to soil health. It's linked to having an ecosystem integrity and diverse ecosystems. And so, understanding those drivers of the loss can then help us also understand what the opportunities for, again, reversing negative trends are. And just, I think one of the emphasis emphases that we want to make clear today in that, avoid the AR3T framework, and that way of thinking, again, land use change is so critical that it is important that we start with the avoid piece. We need to avoid further losses. And so beginning to understand where those interlinkages are within your sourcing and within the rest of your supply chain is incredibly important. Next slide. And I will end with that and pass it over to Biodiversify and Mike to walk you through a little bit more of the report itself and the biodiversity journey that they've articulated. Thanks.
Thank you, Franklin. I've also got a bit of a cold, so apologies for my voice as well. For those of you who don't know us, Biodiversify are a conservation consultancy who help different businesses and organizations improve their relationship with nature, basically. And we've been supporting on the production of this report over the past 9-10 months or so. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes about what we have coined in the report, the biodiversity journey. And this is really about how companies can start to move towards better biodiversity outcomes. And we basically called it this because corporate action on biodiversity is very much a journey. It's fair to say no one has all the answers to move from an extractive system to a regenerative one. And as such, we're kind of all on this journey together, really. Where we stand now with individual companies as well is that people are coming from very different starting points. Some have been thinking, engaging with this for a long time, whereas for others it's brand new. And many actually may face different challenges within their own businesses or own organizations about moving forward with nature and biodiversity as concepts. So as part of this, we really need to start moving away from linear thinking and more towards a kind of circular and adaptive way of operating. We need everyone to come on this journey together in order to achieve systems change. And that means vertically through supply chains, but horizontally as well, with different geographies and potentially even working with competitors as well. So what we've laid out, within this biodiversity journey, as you can see here, is a series of 5 steps that can really be iterated on. And what we're trying to show here is that it means it's okay to kind of get stuck or feel a bit under-resourced in one area, as we can kind of quickly move on and start to think about the next stage with the understanding and the knowledge that we can come back and keep improving on this journey. Some people may have dived into this order already at different places or from different starting points, which is also okay. Very rarely will any of these steps be done perfectly the first time. So this kind of iterative thinking is what we're really trying to encourage through the biodiversity journey. Next slide, please. So the first stage that we talk about, and Franklin's already touched about this, is the understanding of impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. And there are lots of different frameworks out there now. There's lots of different guidance, which different companies may feel different levels of comfort in terms of engaging with, but at their crux, a lot of them align on the same kind of understanding of trying to understand what are the main materials used by the organization, and then where and how these materials are grown or produced. And this can be undertaken with really high integrity traceability data, or just kind of good assumptions through knowledge of supply chains and talking to people. And better understanding of these things can then in turn help us to understand the ecosystems that production relies on. And at this point as well, with things like the preferred materials matrix and textile exchange, you start to understand the different sourcing options available and how we're using them. And there are very different levels of detail that you can get into at this point. And again, it's that idea of an iterative journey. It's about not feeling like you need to get stuck or you can't progress until you've got every little thing figured out. Making a small start and moving on with the knowledge that you've got and coming back to it is much more powerful than waiting sort of months or even years until you've got the resources to kind of go into all the detail. Next slide, please. So by going through this process and using the different tools and expertise that's out there and available, you can start to build a picture of risks and impacts and dependencies associated with material sourcing. What we found in the report from talking to people within the sector is kind of an issue for textiles in that a lot of it is considered high impact. And so when we start to do these assessments, a lot of the supply chain processes are coming out as red or very much high risk or impact, which I think, if anything, shows the importance of the need to work in this area more deeply, and why textiles really need to get a grip of this, but also how more nuanced prioritization, might need to occur by businesses as they go through the journey. Next slide, please. And obviously, when we're trying to think about where things come from, traceability is always one of the big questions. And the biodiversity benchmark report found mixed results on traceability with different materials. So you can see there some of the disparity between them. And although traceability is good, it shouldn't really hinder process in terms of trying to get to action, as we know what needs to occur. Traceability can be increasingly expensive to obtain, and I think as we go forward, organizations are going to have to think about how much attention to kind of divert into traceability, and what are the strength of different assumptions that can be made around some of these things, because we're always going to be working with limited resources, so making sure they're best directed is going to be very important for different organizations. But I think, touching on some of the previous stuff, this is the same problem for a lot of businesses, and a lot of areas of the supply chain. So working together on this is going to make a lot more sense than trying to do it individually. Next slide, please. So once we have some form of understanding about impacts and dependencies, it really provides the opportunity to produce a clear strategy, or plan for biodiversity. Again, this is really important because it allows us to be specific about the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, the resources required to reach them, and also to bring the actual business along. So by developing a strategy, it helps to unpick, why a business is looking to get involved, what's the benefit, and how is it going to do so. And you can see there some of the key questions are things like, what are the motivating factors for taking action? How do company values align? Who are the stakeholders, internal and external, that we might need to engage in doing this? And how do we get internal buy-in? Do we already have buy-in? Is this coming from the top down, or is this something that the sustainability people have really recognized? And again, if we think back to that iterative biodiversity journey, you may need to do a rough cut at this to start with by taking a pulse check with a few key people, and then coming back to it for full development later on, and bringing in that kind of wider segment of the business. And that's okay. Next slide, please. So once we have that understanding and that strategy in place, that then helps us to take meaningful action on biodiversity. And again, as Franklin touched on, what we found consistently through talking to people is that many businesses are already taking action through different work streams, be it on climate or water or waste, for example. But we can start to bring these together within a biodiversity strategy, and it helps pull everything together. This can then help to establish gaps and then really plan where further action needs to occur. And as we've heard, the AR3T framework can be a really useful starting point for thinking about this. Next slide, please. So, as Franklin stressed, the avoid stage is really important of the framework, and we'd like to move up through that system. I'm not going to repeat what Franklin said, but I think the interesting thing about this framework is that transform element as well. And this is really critical in terms of changing systems. This is really about things that are not directly linked to biodiversity, but are nonetheless really important levers of change. And this might be things like cooperative working, driving for legislative change, funding availability, or research and development. So it's very important to think about these wider holistic factors as well, particularly within strategy development, so we can allocate resources appropriately. Next slide, thanks. So one of the key things that we also heard through the interviews was, the need to really best prioritize action. Ultimately, resources are limited, and also it's such a vastly complex space that we can't tackle everything at once, which is another reason for really thinking about that biodiversity journey. So when we think adaptively and iteratively, prioritization is done both based on the science and the data, but also the business, the business mind and the business position, and help us to accelerate towards action faster. And by going through the concept of a journey and iteration, we can begin to refine and prioritize based on learnings that have previously occurred as well. Next slide. And that ultimately basically means we have to accept that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution for biodiversity. And different companies may need to take different directions based on both their sourcing and their business models as well, which I think also means there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to some of this. And, we're kind of increasingly hearing a lot at the moment about green hushing and companies worried about making moves due to attracting criticism about things. But if we can start to normalize the concept of a journey, the concept of iterative development, and hopefully we can start to see, more progress and more support and get that kind of snowball effect going. Next slide, thank you. And then in terms of action, basically, again, from our interviews, 3 kind of key areas came up in terms of enabling factors to help drive towards action. Firstly, we found that there's often a need to bring in further specialist support, either in-house, either with consultants, NGOs, or local networks as well. Because this is such a new space, it's okay to feel a bit behind or lost. Lots of people who are progressing on this or accelerating this are working with others or building that capacity in-house to help accelerate that. Secondly, the role of certification can be really, really helpful. It can, help with traceability, as well as giving some level of assurance that improved practices are being utilized. So, that's really critical. But then thirdly, I think we also need to be thinking beyond and bigger than certification itself. As at the moment, it doesn't hold, those wider landscape issues that Franklin was talking about. So either by working with certifiers to enhance them further, or connecting more within the landscapes that businesses are sourcing from and supporting those is going to be really, really, really important. Next slide, thank you. So as part of the process, we spoke with several producer organizations and certifiers as well. And the good news is that there's a huge amount of amazing work already going on within production landscapes and sourcing environments. Just often people higher up the value chain are not bedded within this system. And, there is a bit of a risk now with, brands and other companies looking for more information, potentially for disclosure, taking interest in these areas more. It might put a pressure on these smaller businesses within the landscapes that kind of almost detracts from the work that's already happening and that needs further support. So next slide, please. So what we see a big recommendation from the report is really to build these strategic collaborations across scales, again through supply chains, across geographies, across landscapes. And this is what's going to enable proper transformative change, which is hugely critical, but also makes really clear business sense because of the way these supply chains currently work. Like we need to work together basically to improve the system. Next slide. So once we've kind of got action going, it's obviously then important that we work out how to measure progress and also kind of report these results. And I think with the frameworks that are coming into play, they may help guide some aspects of this, but making sure that proper cycles of monitoring, evaluation, and learning, integrated within that iterative journey is what will drive improvement and change over the long term. I think particularly when starting to work at the landscape level, you probably start to see multiple objectives required that relate to factors other than biodiversity, social factors, for example, and getting them all moving in the same direction is going to require probably some trial and error. And probably the biggest mistake here is expecting everything to improve in a linear fashion year on year, and just being comfortable with that, basically. Next slide, thanks. And then the final stage on the journey is really to be able to talk about the success and also the challenges openly. The textile industry has huge complexities, but it has actually had a head start on many other sectors, thanks to some of the amazing work done by people like Helen Crowley, whose name's up there, and the other organizations and companies who have been exploring and pushing this narrative for a long time. So we need to learn as we're going on the journey, and that means being more transparent either within individual organizations and not necessarily always just glossing things up internally if there are challenges, but leaders as well kind of expecting things to go wrong. Like, this is a complicated space, and there may need to be elements of cultural shift in terms of this. If everything is going really well, then it probably needs to have some into investigation into it to work out if that's actually the reality. And then final slide for me, please. And this is the final recommendation, the report of the report, really, which is to stress the need for this adaptive model. We need to continue to act faster and better, continue to learn, and then tweak that action for optimal outcomes. So that's the end of my section. I'll hand over to the brand sponsors who very kindly supported this work.
Thank you, Mike. And first up, we are going to hear from Gonzalo at J.Crew, who's not able to join the webinar, but has provided us with a recording.
And I'm the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility for Madewell, the denim brand under J.Crew Group. And I'm really excited today to be here with all of you to launch the Textile Exchange Biodiversity Landscape Analysis report. This is work that we've been doing with Textile Exchange over the past year. So really excited to have this new tool for all the companies in the fashion industry to advance their practices on biodiversity. So first of all, let me start by sharing a little bit of the context of why we are working on biodiversity at J.Crew Group. This is a critical topic, and according to the United Nations, over the past 50 years, the human population has doubled and the global economy has grown fourfold, driving really immense pressure on natural resources. So at J.Crew Group, we recognize that we have a responsibility to protect critical biodiversity. Furthermore, we also know that 81% of the fibers that we use in our company are coming from land-based sources. So think about cotton, wool, cashmere, leather. They all need land. So we know that we rely on healthy and functioning ecosystems to be able to bring our products into market for our customers. And we have identified this opportunity to integrate nature positive aligned practices into delivering our commitment to quality to our customers. So with that, I wanted to share also what we're currently doing at J.Crew Group around biodiversity. Since last year, we actually developed a comprehensive and overarching approach to address our impacts on nature and to tackle biodiversity loss. We have been following the Science-Based Targets Network Action Framework that has 4 key pillars of avoid, reduce, restore and regenerate, and transform. And other than that, we have actually set ambitious goals to be able to improve and work towards protecting biodiversity. As an example, on the area of avoiding, we're actually building on our chemical management strategies and processes to proactively manage chemical and water risks in our supply chain. I'm not going to go through all of the topics here, but another example in the restore and regenerate bucket, we have been working on regenerative sourcing across all natural fibers for our company with a particular focus on cotton. Cotton is our largest fiber. We have 70% of our material footprint coming from cotton. So we know that addressing the farming practices and working on more sustainable farming practices like regenerative farming is a way for us to also address biodiversity. This work doesn't stop here. We're actually continuing through this year, and through the end of this year, we actually will be developing a climate and nature leadership roadmap to identify more priority actions and set impactful timeline for our business. As we continue on this work and we map out how we deliver on our strategy through 2030, we recognize that our progress will not be linear. So we know that tools like this report that Textile Exchange just launched is going to be a great source for us to be able to improve our practices, continue our work. And we also understand that restoring nature requires long-term and unwavering commitment. So collaborating with Textile Exchange on the Biodiversity Landscape Analysis report was an enlightening process for us, and we hope that this new tool will also serve as a blueprint for the fashion industry in general, helping other companies advance their practices in biodiversity. So congratulations, Textile Exchange. Really happy about the report launch, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
And next up, we're going to hear from Veronique Crochet at Puma. I'll hand over to you, Veronique.
Thank you for having me in this call. I'm going to echo Gonzalo. I think it has been a great journey about developing or providing input into this report. It has been also a great learning throughout the process. I'm going to present a few words about Puma and very quickly what we are doing and how we actually going to use this report moving forward. Next slide, please. Puma is one of the sports brand. We are developing, designing, selling, marketing footwear, apparel, and accessory. I'm sorry, I haven't provided you the 2022 data, but we finished with more than 8 billion euro sales in 2022 and 20,000 employees. We are celebrating our 75th anniversary this year. So just to come a little bit to our business mission is forever better, and how to translate that forever faster, sorry, and how we translate that is more like forever is more the mindset, looking at past and future, and faster is more how we are acting from the heart and pushing ourselves. Next slide, please. And that's where comes the Forever Better. So Forever Better is the platform for sustainability to reach our consumer, and how we actually integrating our action for people and the planet into our business, and how we are making ourselves accountable and push one step further. Next slide, please. Our sustainability strategy is defined by what we call the 10 for 25, so 10 different focus areas, for which of them we have goals to meet in 2025. This is based on the Sustainable Development Goals, aligned with the principle of due diligence. We are aiming to create positive impact, so whatever we want to do, we wanted to do it at scale, and together in partnership with our vendors and collaboration with the industry. Next slide, please. So biodiversity came into our 10 for 25 as a new topic. We did a materiality and assessment in 2018, and stakeholder dialogue and biodiversity then came into the picture. So the goal that we set in 2020 was to support the industry in setting up science-based targets, continue our journey to use more sustainable material, and looking at animal welfare. And all of this always with the partnership with the industry. Next slide, please. So what we have done since 2020 is that we have developed a biodiversity and forest protection policy, as well as an animal welfare policy. We joined Canopy to work on viscose suppliers and paper packaging. We also joined the call to action from Textile Exchange and the Leather Working Group on deforestation-free for leather for 2030. And we've been addressing environmental pollution risks through our target and programs with suppliers on climate, chemical, water, and air. In 2022, we actually worked on developing a biodiversity roadmap using the Fashion Pact Biodiversity Strategy Tool Navigator. This roadmap is more a plan to have a plan. Next slide, please. So how we wanted to use this biodiversity landscape report is, first is to focus on the why. I'm just gonna repeat what has been explained before, but that's the only way, instead of starting with the what, to really get internal awareness, to mobilize people in the company with the key functions, to really understand why biodiversity really matters. And then to really set the stage and to align internally on key priorities and commodities. Then definitely how we're going to use this report is to define internally role and responsibility, identify the resource that we need moving forward, and also use the resource. And in this report, there is a lot of resource, a lot of tools available, and this is really helpful for a brand not to start from scratch and have to have all of this mapping done already on what exists out there. And then locate, evaluate, assess, prepare is not from me, but it's from TNFD, which I felt was really sharp and clear on how to do a step-by-step approach on where to understand where the key hotspots are, evaluate, assess, and prepare to actually set up a strategy and goals. And of course, we expect this report will put the industry together for even further collaboration, because when we move more upstream in the supply chain, we really need to join forces to create a real impact. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronique. And before I close us out, there was one quick question around whether, just curiosity around whether Puma still uses the environmental profit and loss, the EP&L, from its previous days with Caring many years ago.
Well, just to correct, Puma was the initiator of the EP&L, and yes, we have actually, of course, we expanded with Caring. So yes, we continue reporting and measuring the financial impact. And just for you to know, I mean, in 2022, we have estimated the land use of 150 million euro just for the land use, for example. So yes, we use it as a tool as assessing the risk, but also for internal training and awareness raising.
Thank you. Great. And then, yeah, just to close us out on next steps. So thanks to all the speakers, by the way, for providing context on hopefully a bit of a good overview for this audience on what the report covers, and a bit around how our sponsor brands are intending to use it. Next steps for textile exchange, similar to the process we went through with the regenerative agriculture landscape analysis report. The next step after that was really to launch what's now our regenerative agriculture community of practice. And we are planning the same on the topic of biodiversity. So at the conference, the Textile Exchange Conference in London later this month, we'll be launching, and I would say sort of relaunching our biodiversity community of practice. Many of you may have been involved in the Textile Exchange Biodiversity working group that was being held several years ago. We're basically going to be dusting off that group and re-engaging it. But again, as with the regenerative agriculture community of practice, the intent is really to provide information sharing, ensure a consolidated view of everything that's happening on this topic across the industry, facilitate connections to different opportunities for action, really help what we call cut through the swirl of this topic, and provide that platform for the industry to convene around this topic and understand what's happening, and understand what the opportunities are. So for those of you attending the Textile Exchange Conference in London, we look forward to potentially seeing you at the launch of the Biodiversity Community of Practice. And with that, we have about 4 to 5 minutes for Q&A. So if there are any other questions, please type them into the questions box now, and I'll just pause a moment and let you have the opportunity to do that. And if no questions, that's fine too. I'll just give it one more beat here. Doesn't look like there are any questions coming in. Any parting thoughts from the panelists? Otherwise, we can wrap. No, thanks. Okay. Next steps. Okay, we do have one question. What are the next steps related to science-based targets for nature specifically? So we wanted to really focus on the community of practice here as kind of one of the main next steps coming out of this landscape analysis report specifically. But there are several other related next steps, I would say. And we do detail some of those in the report. But another one that is relevant here, I think, is that Textile Exchange has really been working on what is our approach to nature and biodiversity related targets in a similar sense to the 45% greenhouse gas emissions reduction target we have set for the industry, in line with science and related to raw materials initial production. So we've been working on that, and those targets will likely be, because of the context-specific nature of no pun intended, nature and biodiversity topics. I think what is likely going to be happening is that will involve less of a specific impact-related target to start, but more of an alignment and encouraging the industry to really lean into aligning around science-based targets for nature and the approach and process that they're taking. So more to come on this, but I think this is something that Textile Exchange is really going to be helping guide moving into the new year, and as the science-based targets for nature methods come online. And we have several sessions that will be talking more about this at the conference as well. One sort of more broadly on kind of updates on different targets that we have set in the industry related to raw materials, and then another session related specifically to science-based targets for nature and the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD, and kind of the latest developments from the companies in our industry who are piloting both of those frameworks. So two other sessions that might be of interest to this community that are coming up at the conference. Thanks for the question. Great question. And I don't see anything else coming in. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up. Thanks again so much, everybody, for your attention. And we hope you get a lot of use out of this report. And as always, please feel free to provide us with feedback, any questions you may have. Again, everyone who signed up to attend this webinar will receive an email with links to the recording and the slides. So with that, have a great day, afternoon, evening, and we'll talk to you soon.